Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark McNack and my co-host Robert Branton are joined today by Tabatha Bull, President and CEO at the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. She discusses how community involvement in projects, particularly through revenue sharing and capacity building, empowers them to reinvest in local and external initiatives and engage as business stakeholders. This is exemplified by renewable energy projects in Ontario, where policy incentives encourage First Nation partnerships by offering higher payments per kilowatt under power purchase agreements. As a result, Indigenous participation and investment is encouraged. Tabatha Bull, CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, CCIB. Great to have you here again. It was super to see you earlier at the summit, and fantastic that you're back in London again. You're through here regularly. You're in Paris, I understand, as well. So it's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to be able to participate again this year, and it's great to be here for conversation.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time out, Tabatha. I know you're very busy and in demand. That was not that long ago, was it? You were doing 17 media interviews one day in a row or something like that. You're constantly doing speaking engagements. So really appreciate the time you've taken out to talk about the CCIB.
Yeah.
It's an organization that's near and dear to my heart because my very first summer office job 40 years ago was working for the CCNB, as it then was, the Canadian Council for Native Business.
When your parents took you as a baby into the office with them, right?
I think CCNB was a year old, and I was a summer hire to help build a directory of Native businesses in Canada. And so to see where it's come to today and where you've taken it, how many members do you have today? How big is that directory today?
Yeah, so today our membership is both Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses because we were 41 years ago, started really with a mandate of bringing corporate Canada and Indigenous businesses together to grow the Indigenous economy. So our membership is still Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses, corporate Canada from every sector, every size across the country. And then Indigenous businesses also in every sector and every size. So today we have about 2,800 members, and about 1,700 of those are Indigenous businesses, and the remainder are non, and both like corporations, institutions, not-for-profits, all looking...
Law firms,
that's right.
McCarthy Teacher was a good member in good standing.
Very good, yes, exactly. And, we've seen significant growth. So about 5 years ago, we just hit 1,000 members. So the last 5 years have been really exponential growth as an organization.
And who's been the CEO for the last 5 years?
That's right. I'm going to say, yes. So I did take over the leadership 5 years ago, March of 2020. And the organization has really grown. And I think, it's not just the CEO, I would say, and to all my predecessors, it's been a, strong growth. I think there's a lot of reasons. One, we were in a pandemic when I took over, and the role that we played to advocate for Indigenous businesses and supporting the Indigenous economy through that period of time definitely showed that there was a need for an organization like ours and the value that we provided. And then, I think Canadians with like George Floyd, and then with the confirmation of the graves at Kamloops, Canadians and corporations really woke up to this social economic gap that existed for businesses and individuals. And that definitely spurred some growth as well. Though I would say, you see people that come on really quickly without doing the education and the learning are just as easily the ones who back away as fast. But some organizations, who really are digging in and wanting to understand how they can do better and learning about our history are making a real impact in areas where we hadn't seen before. So with every new organization and sector, it brings new opportunity to support Indigenous economy as well.
Fantastic stuff. Maybe step back a bit in your personal story before you became CEO.
Yes.
Where are you from? How did you end up in the role you're in today?
So I'm a member of Nipissing First Nation, which is in Northern Ontario, about 3.5 hours north of Toronto. But my dad grew up at Serpent River First Nation, which is about 6.5 hours north of Toronto. My parents live in the community now, but we didn't grow up there. We've had a place there since 1990. So have spent a lot of time in Nipissing. And my parents moved in 2000, and my dad was on council for some time. I'm an engineer by training. And I went into engineering with the purpose to work and support Indigenous communities, my own community and others in spaces where we don't have a lot of engineers or Indigenous people, I should say. My father actually worked for Ontario Hydro in Ontario, and the history of Ontario Hydro with First Nation communities is not a good one. They flooded a number of communities as they moved water around without communities knowing. Communities had to relocate, like the water would just rise in their community and they would have to relocate.
Really?
Yeah, they flooded graveyards in communities. So a very, very difficult history. And that's not unlike what happened in other provinces. Manitoba, very similar occurrences.
Sorry, but without any warning.
Any conversation or discussion or warning. And so he was a mechanical maintainer, so worked like in the plant growing up. And then through his career, and then Ontario Hydro started a group to really work with those communities that they had treated poorly on reconciliation, like before reconciliation was really ever a word. So about 1993. And he spent a lot of time traveling around the province of Ontario, meeting with communities and understanding what the impact was and coming to settlement agreements. And from those settlement agreements, now we see projects being built, and like First Nation communities partnered on projects with what is now called Ontario Power Generation. So part of their settlement would be, we're going to build a project here and you're going to be able to build revenue from that. And it makes me very proud to know that my dad was part of that. And then when I went into engineering, just watching what he did, I firstly was like, I'm not going to go work there because that's where my dad worked. I did end up there eventually. But, there really aren't a lot of Indigenous engineers. And we have a lot of our young people who go into social work and teaching because that's what they see growing up.
Yes.
So wanting to be that bridge, but in a more STEM type area. So I was in electricity for 20 years almost. And the last part of my career, I was able to work with communities across Ontario on renewable projects as Ontario came off of coal and we moved to renewable energy. There was a really good policy decisions to ensure that First Nation and Métis communities in Ontario could participate in those programs. So then I got to travel all over Ontario, meet with communities, many who had met with my dad, which was very full circle for me. And then I kind of got to a point where I felt like I did what I had set out to do and I wanted to do something new and something more national. So made the move to CCAB at the time. We've gone through 3 name changes. I was on the board of CCIB and I really believed in what they did and the work that they did and the impact they had. So made the move there as the chief operating officer and then became CEO in 2020. And It's been an incredible 5 years out for sure.
Just to step back, because I'm still kind of in shock, and I shouldn't be in shock anymore because I've read a lot, I've heard all the stories. But for our listeners to understand, Ontario Hydro is a provincial government organization.
Yes.
So this is the government basically ignoring the people who live there.
Yeah.
They would not get away with that anywhere else of this side, part of Toronto. Okay, we're just going to use that and, oh, by the way, the water's coming.
That's right.
Right?
And they wouldn't now. I mean, at that time, Ontario Hydro owned generation and transmission. So also transmission lines that cross First Nation land. There were like lease agreements that were put in place, but very minimal payments for being able to do that across the land.
And probably not a lot of consultation in advance of that.
No.
We're going to do this and we will give you a little bit of money for the trouble.
Yes, exactly. So we have a lot of hydroelectric in Ontario and diverting water in the springtime and moving water. There was never a conversation with with communities about that. And some of those communities that I have had the honor of visiting, there are still elders there who remember that happening when their village was right next to the water and the water would rise. So they all moved up to a higher level or away from the water, which was, their source of food. And you can still see in some communities where the old village was. But this one particular community was still working through a settlement agreement. It's called Gull Bay First Nation in Northern Ontario. They were still working through an agreement with Ontario Hydro when I came on the scene. And then they were the first community to have a solar battery backup project. They were a diesel community. So it has almost displaced most of the diesel that the community uses. And it was owned in partnership with Ontario Hydro, the province, and the community, with the intention that the community will own that full project in the future.
Yes. So that's why it comes back to UNDRIP. Our audience knows about that now.
Yeah.
United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and why that is so important, was such a game changer as well to help address these issues. And Canada has signed up to it, and that's the law of the land now. So
yeah, I think, not to get too into the details, but within our Constitution in Section 35, it states that you have to work with consult with the community on impact, and that the community has to, those impacts have to be evaluated, and you have to move through those. That wasn't in place at the time when this happened. And now anytime a project is being built or transmission lines are being built, those are subject to the duty to consult, and organizations need to go and meet with those communities. But now we're seeing it's, table stakes. It's a game changer. Like, no corporation even thinks about building anything without first working with a community. And we actually see that those projects move faster when you already have a partner. So now we have the largest transmitter in Ontario. So we were doing energy planning in my old career, going out and meeting with communities and saying there's going to be a need for new transmission or new generation or something in this territory. What would be the best thing for the community? Like, what would you want to see? And also that allowed for communities to start to prepare to be part of that solution. So this was 10 years ago. And now there's a transmission line being built. And 5 of the communities in that territory came together, partnered with a transmitter, and they submitted the bid to build the transmission line. So all of that work had already happened before the call for the need came out. And that's where we see successful projects that are, very much less risk, will be built much faster, because the community is already engaged, they're part of it. And also the benefit to the project. You're employing local people who really care about the territory, who aren't going anywhere. And if we look at like a mining project, when that mine leaves, the people that have worked there care about the land. So reclaiming the land to how it was before, you have much more success in that as well when you have communities involved as project proponents and involved in the planning process.
And so, contrast those former days to the situation now where you have stated policies within companies like Hydro One responsible for the transmission, who have said they will not build any new transmission lines, any significant transmission lines, unless the local Indigenous communities own at least 50% of those transmission lines. And you're seeing communities come together to do just that.
Yeah. And even more so, Hydro One is even looking at, understanding that access to capital and equity is difficult for so many communities. So they've not just said, like, we want communities to have an equity position, but they're also looking at ways that they can help support them to be able to access that capital, which is that second step of corporation needs to go, right? It's great to make a commitment to that, but unless you're enabling that to happen, you're not going to see progress. And it's really great to see that Hydro One is trying to find solutions for investment vehicles, as is, many provinces and the federal government as well.
Yeah, in BC, for example, their recent call for power proposals, and it was a requirement that at least 25% of any of the proposals for new power generation would have Indigenous equity participation. Of the 9 proposals, I think that all but one of them had a majority of Indigenous participation. It's the way things are being done now.
It is. And it's like also then revenue that goes to the community that they can reinvest back into other projects, and the capacity building that comes along with that in a community also, from a business perspective, from being at the table in those conversations and negotiations, allows them to then be investors in other projects, either for their community or for others. And in Ontario, we saw that too with renewable projects. There was incentives to have a First Nation as a partner. They actually get paid a little bit more. It's a power purchase agreement. And they get paid a little bit more for every kilowatt if you have a First Nation project than the projects that don't. So a real incentive driven by policy to ensure that there's participation.
Tabatha, you travel all over and you speak. You were at our summit, our second annual Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit in London. What were your impressions or takeaways from the day with some London investors?
Yeah. And I had the honor of this being my second time attending. So even just seeing the growth in the summit and in the topics, it was so important to have like real case studies of projects that are really building revenue, and for investors to understand the stability of these projects and that they're, progressing towards a revenue generating project. Also, the delegation that was here, it's like incredible to be amongst them, at home in Canada. Those are really like leaders that are pushing forward on Indigenous economies across the country, and many
you're
of
one
them,
of those. You're one of those leaders, and
Thank
part
you.
of that,
Absolutely.
that part
Thank
of
you.
that A team, we had the Ontario Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and like I said at the summit, it's unusual to see a minister who generally they would come in and leave after they've said their piece. Minister Rickford stayed for the entire day, and we asked him why, and he said, because I want to hang out with people like Tabatha.
Yes.
He said it was an incredible lineup, and he wanted to learn and just be around the people here.
So we recently had an election in Ontario, and his title changed a little bit. It's a very long title. But they really understand that any projects in Ontario have to have partnership with Indigenous communities as well. And in the time that we're in, when many of the resources we have across Canada, but critical minerals in Ontario, we're very rich in those. And it's been a conversation for many, many years, the Ring of Fire. And I think the province really is understanding that we won't be moving forward on that unless they get things right with the communities that are going to be impacted. And it's really great to see Minister Rickford speaking those things aloud and attending conferences across the country and globally. When he heard about this summit, his team reached out, and definitely he wanted to be here to learn from everybody. And I know he's been traveling across the country, just really trying to learn about examples about Indigenous economies and making commitments from the province of Ontario on that support as well, which is really, at the summit, Chief Ted Williams from Rama stood up and really made a point to thank him for that time. I think it's a big step for Ontario with our government in that commitment.
Your organization is across Canada. You've got members,
yes,
north, south, east, and west. This year, tariffs have been on the agenda and changed the perception of a lot of business in Canada. Indigenous business, any different? Have you noticed a shift in approach?
I think so. I have the honor of sitting on the Prime Minister's Canada-US Council with respect to our relations with the US, which came after the tariff announcement. So first, I would say representing Indigenous businesses at that table with entrepreneurs and union representatives and, large CEOs is says something about our country's commitment and the importance of Indigenous business, but also a recognition of how much Indigenous business has grown and our participation in supply chains and in government procurement and across the border. So we recently completed 2 large studies with Global Affairs Canada, speaking to Indigenous businesses and trying to understand interest in export and trade and where they were currently trading. And it's actually, of the Indigenous businesses that do export, about 19% of the revenues come from the US. And some of those businesses, up to 90% of the revenues come from the US. If we think about seafood and snow crab, on both of our coasts, there are a lot of Indigenous fisheries and Indigenous owned businesses that are participating in that sector. And during COVID, definitely snow crab got hit really hard just because Americans, the price of everything in the recession was very difficult and people just chose not to purchase. I mean, this is a bit different with the tariffs and with the tariffs from the Chinese on seafood that have come out as well. That sector is going to really need to find other customers to work with. And we see that across the board as well. And a number of our businesses and Indigenous people are very active in the supply chains of oil and gas, mining, forestry, agricultural, all areas that could be very impacted depending how the tariff situation ends or continues.
Here today, gone tomorrow.
Exactly.
Here tomorrow, gone today.
It is so difficult to keep up with what the ever-changing tweets, really. So we're really watching those sectors and the impact on those sectors because those sectors have worked very hard to increase their supply chains from Indigenous businesses and also the participation of Indigenous people in their organizations. So it's not just going to impact, an entrepreneur, but also a family. And in Canada, in Indigenous communities, a number of Indigenous communities have what is called a Economic Development Corporation, which is a corporation that's established to kind of remove the business from the politics of chief and council. And a number of those corporations have various businesses underneath them, but many of them are participating in oil and gas, in mining, in lumber. So those are, those corporations build a revenue, but some of that revenue goes back to invest back into the community, back into programming and daycares and clean water. So if we see a downturn in those economies that impact those development corporations, it's going to have a ripple effect to communities as well. So that's something we're definitely advocating to ensure that supports are provided to those organizations, or if there are reciprocal tariffs, that Canada recognizes the impact that may happen. And then some of our members, had really strong business plans to enter into the US market. So we have a member, Birch Bark Coffee, who supplies coffee to Costco in Canada and was in their business plan to move into the US market. So they've and they've made investments to get into those markets, and now they're having to think about what their alternative is. So we're definitely working on, support for other markets, and that's why these conversations, even if the summit is about investment, it's also about building and strengthening those relationships between Canada and the UK, and ensuring that people in the UK understand the wealth and breadth and skill and expertise of Indigenous business. So, and it could be little things. So we're working with the government of Canada on ensuring that there's Indigenous businesses in the buy list or the catalog for ambassadors across the globe to have gifts from Indigenous business and to be serving Indigenous coffee in, when they have people come to their homes. And some of that is happening already, but I think there's a lot more opportunity. And then also just working on supporting Indigenous businesses to be export ready and to look for other alternatives. And then, of course, within Canada, breaking down our own provincial barriers of trade, that some of our members say it's easier to sell to the US than it is to sell to another province.
Which is crazy.
It's
right.
It really is.
We're one country.
Yeah.
And outside of Canada, I don't think people really appreciate how strong the provinces are. They control natural resource trade, securities for a long time.
It's a very decentralized form of government. You've got a massive land mass. If you're going to convince everybody to be part of one country, one way to do that is to give a lot of power to each of those parts of the country. And we've got provincial.
Freer trade in the European Union than there is in Canada. And a German and a French person will tell you, I'm different than them, but they've been able to have a single market for goods for a long time. And hopefully the crisis that Canada is going through will be used to remove some of these barriers. So it's great the CCIB is fighting, because you're not only fighting for Indigenous business. By breaking down those barriers, all businesses will benefit.
Yes.
The whole Canadian economy will benefit, and we'll all rise up together.
Do you think the political will is there to get that done? I mean, there are some helpful statements being made, but do you see evidence of real intent?
I do. Like, we definitely see movement, and there was definitely some real commitments, but I think it's going to take the business community also. In the past, I think there has been political will, but then there's pushback from the business community, because it's also allowing competition into your space. And if you have that market controlled, allowing new competitors to come in. So we've had definitely discussions around the council table and at other tables that it's not just about the premiers of the provinces. It's also going to take, the business community to see the reciprocal benefit that will come from it. And we're not just talking goods, though. Like, some of it is the size of the tires on the truck, or like some trucks have to have snow tires and some don't. So it's even like a shipping issue from regulations province to province. And it's also about movement of workers and people. And that is across Canada, for us not to recognize someone trained in one province as they in another.
Right. But this is a political leadership issue, because a business objective is to have a monopoly. That's everybody goes out and fights for market share every day, and nobody willingly gives it up.
Yes.
And sometimes they need, here's the framework, here's what we're going to work on. Everybody's going to sacrifice and do it. The European Union, the single market wasn't created. Some businesses wanted it, but a lot were against it.
Right.
And it took the political leadership to say, sorry, this is the future. Services doesn't have a single market in the European Union yet. And now, with the war in Ukraine and the issues with the Americans, now they're starting to push on that very much again. Some banks, we want to be across the EU, but they're the resistance, and it has to be the political leadership, as it was. Margaret Thatcher, good or bad, she created the single market in Europe. That was the price for getting the UK in. Sad they left, but that was the price for getting in. It takes political leadership, and hopefully that's what we'll see in the future in the country, and organizations like the CCIB who are neutral, right? Because you're representing all the businesses across the country, saying, here's what our businesses need to compete, because if we don't get the scale in Canada, we won't compete. We're a country of 40 million. That's not too much smaller than some European countries, and larger than a lot. But if we're chopped up into little markets, 4 million here, 12 million, not a hope.
Yeah, it's definitely demonstrated. As we say often, every crisis is an opportunity, but I think it's also really demonstrated how reliant we are on the U.S. and how businesses are choosing to trade with the U.S. versus trade within their province. And we need to really be looking at how we're going to open up those markets. And also
that is, when the free trade debates, which all of us remember, that was a big discussion. It wasn't, go back to Sir John A. Macdonald and Laurier about what are we going to do in terms of market access with the U.S. It's been an existential question for Canada all the time. There was a huge thing. If we're giving up our sovereignty, and we'll be in trouble if we go for a free trade agreement with the U.S., which we first did, and then Mexico joined later. So this is a little bit of the consequences of that, because it is easier. If you're in a single market, of course you're going to compete there. So hopefully this reduces those barriers, So companies can compete effectively and be more competitive, and then they can export abroad, like to the UK.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's also opening up lots of opportunities for infrastructure build across Canada as well. And, investing back into projects across Canada on infrastructure and for Indigenous businesses and communities, that's an incredible opportunity for them to be part of the economy and part of the build and being able to have own source revenue within communities. And, and even in supply chains, we know lots of corporations are looking within their supply chains at where they're purchasing from now. And in the Buy Canada campaign, we've launched a Buy Indigenous to Buy Canada campaign, and with a logo that can be downloaded and buttons and stickers. And I will tell you, people are like calling to purchase the buttons and stickers. The views and downloads that we've had of this logo for people to put onto their websites is more than we've ever seen. Fantastic. Definitely our best campaign ever. The more that we can ensure that people understand that there are Indigenous businesses in every sector. So sometimes we might meet with a corporation. I mean, procurement is one of our biggest priorities. We see it as a huge opportunity to build the Indigenous economy. And we might meet with a corporation who's like, well, I don't buy anything that an Indigenous business would make. And we have to, do you buy coffee? Do you buy pens? Do you do graphic design? It's yes. Even if you're not a huge company that does a lot of buying, everything that you are purchasing, there's an Indigenous business that can do that. Us ourselves as a not-for-profit, and a lot of we do a lot of travel, so that's a lot of our expenses. But last year, our spend with Indigenous business was over 25% of our spend. And that's from graphic design to web design to the events that we put on to if we're hosting an event, we ensure we're doing it at a First Nation owned hotel. So there's a real opportunity here for us to have people ensure that they're replacing a U.S. business with a First Nation owned or Métis owned business.
Let's back up to some of the delegates you met at the summit and the perspective coming from the UK. So you're looking, and let's say you're a corporate, you don't have a subsidiary in Canada yet. Let's do two scenarios. You don't have a subsidiary and you're an enterprise, right? So large business. So who should I talk to first? Because, we've decided Canada is on the radar. We're interested in different sector. Do we go start talking to the communities first? Is it worth checking in with CCIB to give us some guidance on what to do?
Yeah, always come, we do have many delegations that approach us if they're coming to Canada to, just understand working with Indigenous business or communities. But, there are lots of other organizations and leaders that were at the summit. First Nation Major Projects Coalition works with a number of communities. So they have an understanding of what type of sectors those communities want to potentially participate in, or if there's a project already in existence that maybe there's an investment opportunity for. Canada Infrastructure Bank as well. They are investing in significant projects in communities that are building infrastructure, but are also revenue generating.
We're going to have Hilary Thatcher, the managing director there of Indigenous Investments, with us on an upcoming podcast.
Yeah, and they have really made some incredible projects come to fruition through both their investment in it, but then also private investment and government investment. So really looking at all the options on a project and extremely good due diligence on that project, really evaluating if that project is, the risk around it and the revenue around it. If you're a corporation and wanting to work with Indigenous business, to bring in culture into your organization, we're definitely the place to go for that. But I think, the Indigenous economy, as you probably saw at the summit, we all know each other and work closely together. And
That's
we all,
clear.
It's
friendly competition, but we're all in this together.
Yeah.
So,
and we're all trying to create a piece that works together, right?
Yes.
So we're really supporting entrepreneurs and businesses, community-owned businesses, from training or procurement or those corporate partnerships or government advocacy. But there's other organizations that do financing for businesses. There's other organizations who do financing for projects in community. But it's going to take all of us to be, doing the best that we can in the work that we do to bring together.
What is great, and it's sort of relatively new, it's not even 10 years old yet, I don't think. CCIB has been around for 41 years, but some of the other organizations you've talked about are much younger. But the impact you're all having now is much different than, say, even 10 years ago, I think. Either way, the ecosystem now of Indigenous-led institutions, organizations, is really, really incredible and inspiring to see the way they're all working together. Different perspectives and different areas of expertise and one common goal.
Yeah.
So let's go to the other scenario.
Yeah.
I'm a corporate. There's some big companies in the UK who have subsidiaries in Canada. Now, say they were at the summit or they've heard about Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit and just Indigenous business, and there's something going on. Where would they go to kind of how can they get an assessment of their subsidiary?
Yeah.
Because they're holding their directors and CEOs responsible. We have all worked in head offices with, country markets and GMs who, don't want to share that with the head office, because where can they go to get an assessment or perspective that they can set metrics and benchmarks for their subsidiary? Would that be yourselves?
Yes. Yeah, definitely for a corporation. So we have a program called Partnership Accreditation and Indigenous Relations that has been, I think we're on year 23 of that program. We have about 250 organizations across Canada who are either going through the program or are certified in the program. And it's kind of like a B Corp certification, except it's how you're working with Indigenous businesses, communities, your Indigenous employees. So there's a lot of subsidiaries. There's a lot of global corporations that their Canada operations are in that program today. All of the major banks, a lot of mining firms, a lot of resource sector firms. And a lot of them have actually said, can you make this so it could apply globally? So our other partners in other countries could also be doing, could have the same type of accreditation. And we are looking at that. It's a bit down the road for sure. But there's lots of, particularly in countries that have Indigenous populations, there's lots of lessons that can be transferred from those organizations.
So if I'm a corporate here in the UK listening to the podcast, and my in-country management in Canada hasn't told me about this, I think I'm going to go check them out and ask them, do you have this certification that you have?
Yeah.
And,
and this is definitely something that is changing every day. And, the U.S. administration is having an impact on that as well. But if we, as corporations are looking at their ESG scores or how they're operating in a market or what's their, what do consumers feel about them? In Canada, it's becoming more and more important to look at how businesses are working with Indigenous communities and people. And shareholders are asking through proxies and demanding through proxies that corporations have what we would call a reconciliation action plan or an Indigenous inclusion strategy, and that they have a program around procurement from Indigenous businesses. So the Toronto Stock Exchange, they had a shareholder proxy. Sun Life had a shareholder proxy. A couple other companies, and many of them didn't even have to get to the board. The management agreed, and that was the case with Toronto Stock Exchange. And the result of that is that they entered into our PAIR program. The program, requires that the board has a mandate around how they're working with Indigenous people. So it's also from a leadership perspective. I sit on a couple boards, and it's not just something that comes up maybe in your governance committee meeting, but it's really something that the board has ownership over, which is so important because it needs to be across your company, not just within if you have an Indigenous relations team, but there's also a requirement that you have a working group that has representatives from your business development team and your comms team and your HR team. So everybody is committed to looking with whatever work they're doing at how they're working with Indigenous people. You have 3 years to look at what you can do and set targets. And then at the end of those 3 years, we have Indigenous business leaders who go into the organization. They meet with the communities that you work with. They meet with your Indigenous employees. They look at your spend, and then they make a recommendation at your certification level. And then you have to renew your certification every 3 years. So you can't just get the certification and then stop doing the good work. And we have members that have, continue to renew, and maybe they get bronze the first year and they work even harder to hit silver or gold. And we even see a little bit of competition in certain sectors, like with the banks or law firms or energy firms, if one's gold certified and one isn't. And it's making an impact on Indigenous economy and businesses because they're wanting to do better. We've had some conversations as well with the stock exchange, looking at the performance of those companies that are certified versus all other SP 500 companies. And it shows a 20 basis points improvement of the companies that are certified. So there's also, there's some corporations who are doing it because they understand truth and reconciliation and they want to be a better business. And there's some that need to know what the return of investment is, because it's not an easy certification to get. And I think as we continue to see change in the US, backing away from DEI programs and supplier diversity, we're really watching those corporations that have operation in Canada and are members of ours or not to see if they will also back away. But the difference is Indigenous people in Canada are constitutional rights holders. We fully support. That's
program.
Right. This is not
a fundamental
DEI
right.
Supply. Exactly. And we're being very clear to ensure that corporations in Canada remember that Indigenous procurement is a, it's the obligation of every Canadian, every corporate Canadian who has benefited from Indigenous people being excluded from the economy.
Yes.
And they all have a role to play in reconciling that. And this is a way of doing that. And we're seeing we're not seeing organizations back away. It's not really taking a lot of convincing, but it's definitely something that we're watching. And it's important for shareholders, consumers, for where people want to work as well. So for a global firm here in the UK who has a subsidiary in Canada, it's important for that corporation in Canada to be working towards supporting Indigenous people in various ways. But we're like the PAIR certification program is definitely a place where people can really understand what work they're doing.
Great. And they can find that on your website.
Yeah.
Tabatha, thanks again for taking the time to visit with us. We could have gone on and maybe in a future episode we will. But for now, Nyawan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Miigwech.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you to Tabatha Bull for sharing her insights with us. And thank you for viewing and listening. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.